Hello, everyone. Welcome to the second day of the 2023 International E-Conference on Holocaust Studies. My name is Dr. Mehek Burza, and I'm the head of the Holocaust and Religious Studies in the Global Center for Religious Research, founded and headed by Dr. Darren Slade. Keep in mind that each of these presentations are video recorded, so the information presented here will be available free of charge to you just for coming out and supporting us. So thank you for that. Now, for those attending live, feel free to use the chat box to discuss with other attendees or to ask questions as they come up. Our speakers will do their best to answer your questions at the end of their presentation. You will be also able to unmute yourself at the end so that you can directly ask the presenter questions by your own. And with that said, it gives me immense pleasure to introduce our speaker for this session, Professor Kenneth Hanson. Professor Hanson is an associate professor and coordinator of the University of Central Florida Judaic Studies program. Having earned a PhD in Hebrew Studies from the University of Texas at Austin, he has since published 5 books and a number of scholarly articles focusing on the Dead Sea Scrolls, Second Temple Judaism, and early Christianity. Professor Hanson, welcome, and over to you.
Thank you. So good to be here and to be able to share. It is the end of the fall 2023 semester at my university, University of Central Florida, Orlando, and I just happen to be teaching a course as we speak, finishing a course on the history of the Holocaust. So this particular e-conference couldn't be more appropriate, even though, as I mentioned, it's the end of the semester, and of course I have plenty of papers to grade. Nonetheless, I'm really happy to be sharing this afternoon, this evening, this morning, wherever you are. And I'm going to share a particular paper that I wrote. And after I read the paper, I'm going to showcase a couple of videos that I have produced for the course that I teach on the history of the Holocaust. I teach the entire course through AI video, and that's an entirely new technology that I'm working with. I'm very, very excited about it. So we'll get into all that, but first let me share the paper. It's called Nazi Terror, the Evolving Persecution, 1933 to 1939. If there were anything at all that I would want to share, want to say about the Holocaust, crystallizing the content into one presentation, this would be it. So let me charge into it by saying we are accustomed to looking at the Shoah, the Holocaust, through the lens of the victims, more than 11 million of them. However, we cannot arrive at a serious understanding of the tragic events that took place without considering the motives of the perpetrators. When did the final solution actually take shape? Can we pinpoint the moment or even the general time frame in which Hitler's madness was transformed from wild rhetorical flourishes to serious exterminatory design? One thing is clear, even well into the Nazi reign of terror, official policy might conceivably have taken a very different course. This is especially true in light of decisions taken during the years prior to the outbreak of the Second World War, and one year in particular, 1937. A serious study of the competing forces within the Nazi regime is in order, illuminating both radicals and moderates, so as to gain a better understanding of what may and may not have transpired in the evolving persecution of the Jews and other minorities within the Third Reich and conquered territories. Is it conceivable that Hitler might have chosen a less radical path? Might different circumstances have prompted his regime to side with the institutionalizers in his government rather than the most stridently genocidal voices? The one certainty is that the history of the Holocaust was by no means set in stone. But first, we need to consider the question of how the Nazis chose to govern and to rule. Were the German people cowering in fear as Hitler forced them to do his bidding? Or did Hitler and all his minions prefer to rule through consensus? Truth be told, the Nazis well understood that you don't rule with terror. You have to have your own people squarely behind you. In fact, we have to be careful about saying that the Germans and other peoples were under the Nazis. In reality, people consented. They were actually happy with the system. And why shouldn't they be? After all, 50 days a year were holidays devoted to the Nazi Party. Hitler's birthday was an especially prominent day of celebration. People willingly went to great stadiums at Nuremberg and elsewhere for mass Nazi rallies. It was important to keep the people stirred up and excited. Complacency is counterproductive, and the Nazi leaders began to fear it. As far as the Nazis were concerned, a fascist state like Italy under Franco amounted to stagnation. There must be an ongoing cultural revolution, and anyone who might prevent that revolution from continuing had to be removed. By 1937, the tension between competing factions in the Nazi Party had come to a head. Those who favored institutionalizing and settling down the Nazi revolution were opposed by the radicals, and vice versa. Hitler was actually afraid that he himself might be removed. After all, people were still suffering the effects of the Great Worldwide Depression. Consequently, Hitler began to act, to stir afresh the fires of the Nazi Revolution. He remilitarized the Rhineland, which had been demilitarized by the Treaty of Versailles. The Nazi Minister of Finance, Hjalmar Schacht, as one of the conservative, quote-unquote, voices in the Nazi regime, was mostly concerned about the German economy, and he feared that any such rearmament would cause a spike in inflation. Consequently, Hitler never even showed Schacht his plan. As state policy evolved, 1937 indeed proved to be the pivotal year in the Nazi Revolution. In that year, Hitler undertook a twofold radicalization of his regime. First, there was to be an internal purge of anyone contaminated with the so-called Jewish spirit. Schacht was removed from his post. The German ambassadors to Tokyo and Rome were recalled. Opposition voices were imprisoned, including clergy. By now, Lutheran minister Martin Niemöller and his pastoral comrades had become increasingly alarmed by what they saw as the Nazification of the German churches, as anti-Christian ideas were increasingly tolerated by both clergy and laity. They were especially alarmed by the racial doctrines of the Nazis, what we might call Nazi racial ideology. And that in turn begs a question discussed by serious scholars of the Shoah as to whether Hitler ever even possessed a coherent ideology. After all, he was first and foremost a politician, and astute historians are confronted with the question of how often political figures articulate a consistent ideology. Moreover, one must ask what might be deemed proof of such an ideology in Hitler's mind. Of course, we have Hitler's writings, the most famous of which was his autobiography, Mein Kampf. Doesn't Hitler plainly state his ideology in this book? But we have a problem in that Mein Kampf was written after Adolf Hitler had become a politician, which alone casts doubt on it as a truthful reflection of Hitler's mindset. By the same token, Hitler's speeches were also delivered after he became a politician. Moreover, if we cannot trust Hitler's writings and cannot trust his speeches, well, what about his actions? Even here, Hitler was not only a politician, but arguably an opportunist, as he tried to please everyone. It's argued that he had no deep-laid plans, only the daydreams of a political thinker. To the capitalists, he promised a capitalist paradise. To the socialists, he promised a socialist paradise. To all Germans, he promised a great resurgence of Germany as a world power. In the final analysis, Hitler's actions prove nothing. We must find something else, perhaps in the form of a document that he wrote before he ever became a politician. Fortunately for historians, we do have such a document in the form of a letter written by Hitler during the time when he was employed by the German army to gather intelligence on the inroads of socialism into the ranks of the military. Of course, Hitler equated Jews with socialists. His letter on the Jewish question, dated September 16th, 1919, includes the following, quoting him: "Anti-Semitism as a political movement should not and cannot be determined by emotional factors, but by a realization of the facts. And these facts are, first, Jewry is clearly a racial and not a religious group." And Hitler then follows with another claim, quoting him: "All that which is for men a source of higher life, be it religion, socialism, or democracy, is for the Jew merely a means to an end, namely the satisfaction of his lust for power and money." And the next sentence is perhaps the most important. Quoting, "His actions will result in a racial tuberculosis, Rasentuberkulose in German, of peoples. Jews are considered to be an infection, a disease. In Hitler's mind, Jews were carriers of a disease which needed to be eradicated, just as a healthy body seeks out and destroys viral and bacterial infections. It amounted to what might be called political hygiene. He then reiterates that anti-Semitism must not be emotional, but rational. Quoting Hitler, "Anti-Semitism, based on purely emotional grounds, will find its ultimate expression in the form of pogroms, which are capricious and thus not truly effective. Rational anti-Semitism, however, must pursue a systematic legal campaign against the Jews by the revocation of the special privileges they enjoy, in contrast to other foreigners living among us. But the final objective must be the complete removal of the Jews. Die Entfernung der Juden überhaupt." Complete removal of Jews. And historians strain at every word in German, every single word, to try to get a better handle on what he actually means. What did Hitler mean by the complete removal? Was Hitler's anti-Semitism murderous, even at that early date? Characteristically, he writes in euphemism. He's deliberately vague, as if to say, I have a nightmare, Jews are present. But I have a dream, Jews disappear, just disappear. He does not say how they are to disappear. They are simply to be gone. That Hitler denounces emotional anti-Semitism comes as a shock to many. Now, wasn't Adolf Hitler extremely emotional in his anti-Semitism? Wasn't this evident every time he made a public address? Yet Hitler insists on the rationality of his program. And the fact that he later echoes these ideas in Mein Kampf is evidence that he was not merely engaging in daydreams, but possessed a clearly formulated racial ideology. And thanks to this important letter from 1919, we know that what Hitler wrote years later in Mein Kampf, after he became a politician, is in fact an accurate reflection of Nazi racial ideology. Here he likens the Jews to vermin, quoting him in Mein Kampf. Was there any form of filth or profligacy, particularly in cultural life, without at least one Jew involved in it? If you cut even cautiously into such an abscess, you found, like a maggot in a rotting body, often dazzled by the sudden light, a kike. It's the body's nature to eliminate infections and parasitic threats, and it does so efficiently and silently. Moreover, disease-carrying rats are hunted and killed by cats, who are acting according to their own nature and who obviously feel no remorse for the killing of mammalian creatures who are obviously sentient beings. Another example might be a professional hitman who neither knows his victim nor feels pangs of guilt when pulling the trigger. He is simply doing his job. The SS might be understood as an army of such hitmen. Elie Wiesel, when asked by Bill Moyers whether he felt the hatred of the Nazis, thought for a moment and replied that in truth, he did not. He said, "We could not even say that they hated us. We weren't worthy of their hatred. They didn't even hate us." How could they, when anti-Semitism was not a matter of hatred, according to Hitler, but a matter of law? As Hitler had declared in 1919, the campaign against the Jews must be legal. The last word people associate with the Nazis is legal. But for Hitler and his minions, this was very important. They passed law after devastating law, and in the end, essentially made murder legal. Jews, after all, were considered foreigners, notwithstanding that they had been living among fellow Germans for centuries, and that they felt more at home in Germany than any other country on earth. All privileges they had in law needed to be revoked. Returning to Martin Niemöller, it was on Sunday, June 27th, 1937, that he concluded his sermon as follows. "We have no more thought of using our own powers to escape the arm of the authorities than had the apostles of old. No more are we ready to keep silent at man's behest when God commands us to speak. For it is and must remain the case that we must obey God rather than man." 3 days later, he was arrested, spending the next 8 months in Berlin's Moabit prison. He was later convicted of abuse of the pulpit and for taking collections, and sentenced to 7 months imprisonment. He was released on time served, but while leaving the courtroom, he was placed in protective custody by the Gestapo and interned in the Sachsenhausen and Dachau concentration camps until 1945. He is, of course, mostly remembered for the little poem he wrote. "First, they came for the communists, and I didn't speak up because I wasn't a communist. Then they came for the Jews, and I didn't speak up because I wasn't a Jew. Then they came for the Catholics, and I didn't speak up because I was a Protestant. Then they came for me, and by that time, there was no one left to speak up for me." As Hitler continued his turn toward radicalism in 1937, he himself became Chief of Staff and Minister of War. Another radical, Ribbentrop, was now Foreign Minister. The post-Schacht economy was now to be run by Hermann Goering, who really didn't know much about the economy. The second part of Hitler's radicalization was external. A decision was taken to invade the Soviet Union. While not carried out until 1941, the infamous Operation Barbarossa, it was decided upon in 1937. As Holocaust scholar Yehuda Bauer wrote, on November 5th, 1937, Hitler informed his chief generals and confidants that Germany was to be prepared for war within the next few years, that Czechoslovakia and Poland would be eliminated, and that Germany would expand into Russian territory, as recorded in the protocols by Officer Friedrich Hossbach. The so-called Hossbach Memorandum is the critical piece of evidence needed to demonstrate that 1937 was in fact the pivotal year. Hitler did not have to take a radical turn. Nothing was set in stone. He might have listened to his finance minister, Hjalmar Schacht. And if he had, there may well have been no such thing as a Holocaust. But he decided that he didn't need professionals in his government. He needed idealists, purists, people who believed in Nazi racial ideology. As it turned out, the radicalism of 1937 brought into focus the fateful year of 1938, and ultimately the final solution itself. It was Jewish policy that was the cornerstone of this radical turn and was designed to help consolidate the Third Reich. Hitler had to cure what he conceived as the disease of the body politic. And that involved removing leaders of his own government, conservatives, who had been Judaized. Though they may have been good anti-Semites, they were nonetheless infected with the Jewish spirit. As far as Hitler was concerned, everything that was against him, all opposition voices, even the behavior of the Allies, was Jewish spirit. Even as late as 1943, when the Jews had been removed from German soil, the propaganda continued. The Jewish spirit is still here. In 1938, a new wave of anti-Jewish steps was unleashed. It was all about getting back to the origins of the National Socialist Party, back to basics, as it were. According to Nazi racial ideology, Germans don't confiscate property, they Aryanize Jewish property. Communists confiscate, we Aryanize. In confiscation, property goes to the elite. In Aryanization, it's distributed to everybody. The procedure was adopted not just in Germany, but in every country the Nazis conquered. A public auction would be held in which Jews were forced to sell their property for a small percentage of its value. Let people enjoy a criminal system. So when harsher steps were taken, no one would protest. By now, the Nazis were well prepared to burn their bridges with the civilized world. But everything must proceed according to good German order. The auctions were carefully organized, starting and ending at specific hours. And the bulk of the populace, who profited from it all, were more than happy to turn a blind eye. They didn't want to know what was happening to the Jews. Let them disappear. It's none of my business. It's not surprising that even at the post-war Nuremberg trials, it was easy for the defendants to say, I didn't know about it. I didn't know about it. In a sense, the Nazi methodology was able to psychologically entrap entire populations. Even the churches, with the exception of Martin Niemöller, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and other brave opponents of the Nazis, decided that the Jewish question was none of their business. There were even those who served as nurses in Hitler's notorious euthanasia hospital. No one was forced. The Gestapo wasn't like Stalin or Big Brother. The Nazis ruled through consensus. In early 1939, at the 6th anniversary of Hitler's rise to power, his radical turn was strongly in evidence as he delivered his famous prophecy speech, quoting Hitler, Today, I will once more be a prophet. If the international Jewish financiers inside and outside Europe succeed in plunging the nations once more into a world war, then the result will not be the Bolshevization of the earth and thus the victory of Jewry, but the annihilation of the Jewish race in Europe. If then, if war, then annihilation. If then reasoning. Though Hitler often went off script during his remarks, on this occasion he paused and carefully read every word. In his mind, there was no criminal intent here. It was all predestined. Hitler repeated the same speech in 1942, underscoring his radical intent, in which he never wavered. Even as the tide of war turned decisively against Germany, his radicalism continued. In February 1943, propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels delivered his total war speech. It was the quintessence of radicalism. Goebbels concluded, quote, 2,000 years of Western history are in danger. And he blamed Germany's failures on the Jews. While Goebbels referred to Soviet mobilization as devilish, he explained, we cannot overcome the Bolshevist danger unless we use equivalent, though not identical, methods in a total war. The speech launched a mobilization campaign that arguably prolonged the war under the slogan, Und Sturm brich los, and storm break loose. Is it conceivable that Hitler might have chosen a less radical path? Might different circumstances have prompted him to side with the institutionalizers in his government rather than the most stridently genocidal voices? The only thing we can be sure of is that Hitler's dream remained. Jews were to disappear. All that would remain would be the abstract Jewish spirit. And that's my presentation. So again, if I could share anything at all about the Holocaust, as we say in Hebrew, al regel achat, on one foot, that would be it. It's really two basic ideas. Nazi racial ideology, which in my mind is so significant. People always ask me, how could the Nazis have done this? How could they have murdered people? How could the furnaces been going full blast in the death camps? And it meant nothing to the Nazis. They would go home and have dinner with their families. And they don't understand this because they don't understand Nazi racial ideology. It's like these were hitmen. Or another example I like to use is an exterminator. If your house is infected with vermin of some kind, who do you call? You call the Orkin man, I suppose, who comes with his little wand and starts spraying every corner of your house. Is he consumed with hatred? Is he consumed with emotion? Does he stare at the cockroaches shouting, I hate you, I hate you? No, he's just doing a job. That's what it was like in the Nazi mind. They were just doing a job. It was political hygiene. And in tandem with that, the other point that I think explains the Holocaust better than anything else I know is by pointing at the radicalization that took place in one single year, that nothing was set in stone, that it didn't have to take a radical turn. The whole Nazi Reich was, of course, anti-Semitic, but there's a difference between anti-Semitism and exterminatory anti-Semitism. That did not have to happen. And had it not been for Hitler himself, I'm convinced, and so are other scholars, there would not have been the annihilation of 6 million. Schacht would never have done such a thing. Other anti-Semitic Nazis high in the Reich would never have done such a thing. Hitler removed them all, and he took that radical turn. That explains so much. So I know we have some time left, and as I shared, I want to highlight some of what I'm doing in the world of AI now. I'm teaching online. There is a great demand in the university system now for online learning. Students really expect it. So one way that I've come to cope with this, since I can't meet my students face to face anymore, is I produce videos. And the real revolution that's taking place is the use of AI now to create incredible historical videos that the professor can actually craft. In my case, I edit these myself, and I'm going to give you a taste of at least one of them. If we have time, I can show both of them. The first one is 19 minutes long, and you'll get a taste now of what we can do to share. And in this case, I'm sharing the same themes that I just spoke about. What we can do with AI to create a real television episode. So here we go as I share my screen on Nazi racial ideology. I'm Professor Kenneth Hanson of the University of Central Florida Judaic Studies program, and I'd like, with a little help from AI, to get inside the heads of the Nazi ideologues of the Third Reich, including Adolf Hitler himself, to understand with clarity what drove this pure evil, and who better to explain Nazi racial ideology than one of its victims, a German Lutheran minister who stood up against it and paid the price for his courage. It's time to meet Pastor Martin Niemöller.
Mein Name ist Martin Niemöller, ein lutherischer Geistlicher, der dafür bekannt ist, ein leidenschaftlicher Gegner des vielleicht verabscheuungswürdigsten Menschen der Geschichte zu sein, Adolf Hitler. Allerdings muss ich gestehen, dass mein Erbe etwas gemischt ist, wie wir sehen werden.
I was born in Lippstadt, Germany, and became in my younger years a submarine commander during the First World War. I won the Iron Cross First Class, the highest decoration for bravery. After the war, I turned to different pursuits. I decided to take up the study of theology, a very different path from my wartime exploits. I was ordained in 1931, taking up a pastorate at St. Anne's Church in an affluent suburb of Berlin. Yet, I was an ardent German nationalist, and it is with considerable shame that I must confess to being an early supporter of this man Hitler. I welcomed his rise to power in Germany as I penned my autobiography in 1933, From U-Boat to Pulpit. It was the Nazis' praise that helped bring this book to fame in Germany, becoming a bestseller. I, as so many in Germany in those days, referred to those years of the Weimar Republic as years of darkness. It was a time of national humiliation. It was my hope that Hitler would bring about a great revival of the German nation. We longed for certainty in an uncertain age. But by the fall of 1934, my faith in Hitler completely collapsed. I saw the dark side of the Third Reich. It was at that time that I helped organize, with other members of the clergy, what we called the Confessing Church, a group devoted to swimming against the tide. We were alarmed by what we saw as the Nazification of the German churches, as anti-Christian ideas were increasingly tolerated by both clergy and laity. We were especially alarmed by the racial doctrines of the Nazis, that is, Nazi racial ideology. Yet some historians look back and question whether Hitler even had an ideology. After all, he was, first and foremost, a politician. And we must ask, what politician actually has an ideology? If we wanted to find some coherent ideology in Hitler's mind, what would we look at as proof? Of course, we have Hitler's writings, the most famous of which was his autobiography, Mein Kampf, My Struggle. Doesn't Hitler plainly state his ideology in this book?
Die gesamte menschliche Kultur, alle Ergebnisse von Kunst, Wissenschaft und Technologie, die wir heute vor uns sehen, sind fast ausschließlich das Produkt der Arier. Wenn wir die Menschheit in 3 Gruppen einteilen würden, die Gründer der Kultur, die Kulturträger, Kulturzerstörer, als Vertreter der ersten Gruppe kamen nur die Arier in Frage. Von ihm stammen die Grundlagen und Mauern der gesamten menschlichen Schöpfung.
We have a problem, however. Mein Kampf, it seems, was written after Adolf Hitler became a politician. And what politician tells the truth even in the book he writes? If we can't trust what he wrote, what about Hitler's speeches? Such an orator he was, capable of captivating an audience like no one else, even like a preacher. He could have been quite a preacher. Didn't Adolf Hitler's speeches express his true ideology? Unfortunately, his speeches were also delivered after he became a politician. If we can't trust Hitler's writings and can't trust his speeches, what about his actions? Don't actions speak louder than words? Except Hitler was not just a politician, he was an opportunist. So even in his actions, he tried to please everyone. To the capitalists, he promised a capitalist paradise. To the socialists, he promised a socialist paradise. And to everyone, he promised a great resurgence of Germany as a world power. In the final analysis, Hitler's actions proved nothing. We must find something else, perhaps some documents that he wrote before he ever became a politician. Here we have the young Hitler, standing in a crowd celebrating Germany's entry into World War I. Hitler, of course, served in the war as a corporal. That was certainly a point in Hitler's life before he became a politician. Do we perhaps have a document dating from that period? Well, we do happen to have such a document, a letter written by Hitler during the time when he was employed by the German army to gather intelligence on the inroads of socialism into the ranks of the military. Of course, Hitler equated Jews with socialists, and he wrote his notorious letter on the Jewish question, dated September 16th, 1919.
Antisemitismus als politische Bewegung sollte und kann nicht durch emotionale Faktoren bestimmt werden.
This statement comes as a shock to most people. Wasn't Adolf Hitler extremely emotional in his anti-Semitism? When we even mention the name Hitler, we think of him ranting and raving, shouting and screaming. And yet he writes that anti-Semitism cannot be determined by emotional factors. He goes on.
Sondern durch die Erkenntnis der Tatsachen. Und diese Fakten sind: Erstens ist das Judentum eindeutig eine rassische und keine religiöse Gruppe.
Importantly, there was a great shift that took place in the 19th century. From religious anti-Semitism, calling Jews Christ killers and seeking either to convert them or murder them, to racial anti-Semitism. Jews came to be defined as a racial, not a religious group, and Jewishness was defined as something in the blood. In the past, if you were lucky, you could escape persecution by converting to Christianity. No more. No certificate of baptism could change the Jewishness in the blood. This shift laid the groundwork for what would become exterminatory anti-Semitism.
Alles, was für den Menschen eine Quelle höheren Lebens ist, sei es Religion, Sozialismus oder Demokratie, ist für den Juden lediglich Mittel zum Zweck, nämlich die Befriedigung seiner Macht und Geldgier.
How many times down through history has that charge been aired? Money-grubbing Jew. The next sentence in Hitler's letter is perhaps his most important.
Sein Handeln wird zu einer Rassentuberkulose der Völker führen.
Jews are considered to be an infection, a disease. And how does a healthy body combat disease? I am not a physician, but I understand that there are certain autoimmune reactions. It's the lymph nodes that secrete white blood cells, isn't this correct? Which silently course through the bloodstream and identify the invading agent and kill it. Now, does this reaction happen consciously? Am I aware that when I am attacked by a virus, my body fights it in this way? Am I emotional about it? Are the white blood cells emotional? Do they announce to the invading bacteria, I hate you, I hate you? Of course not. This is simply the response of a healthy body to disease. And this is the essence of racial anti-Semitism. In Hitler's mind, Jews were a disease of the body politic, and the healthy body fights this disease without emotion. People are flabbergasted at this. What do you mean? The Nazis didn't go around spewing hate? Technically, I must confess, they did not. Noted Holocaust survivor Elie Wiesel was asked, "Did you feel their hatred?" He thought for a moment and replied,
"To be honest, no. We could not even say that they hated us. We weren't worthy of their hatred. They didn't even hate us."
The healthy body simply kills, and it does so without emotion.
Daraus folgt, rein emotional begründeter Antisemitismus wird seinen letzten Ausdruck in Form von Pogromen finden, die willkürlich und daher nicht wirklich wirksam sind.
What is a pogrom? There had been many pogroms across Eastern Europe and Russia during the Tsarist era. Basically, they were organized riots, aided and abetted by the authorities themselves. Emotional? Yes. Violent? Yes. But then it was over. The Nazi attitude toward pogroms was, surprisingly enough, negative. Why, you would imagine that the Nazis would applaud pogroms. But such things were, in their eyes, un-German. After all, they were technically illegal, even though the authorities themselves approved them. Hitler wanted everything to happen by law, and that's why Hitler called them capricious and not truly effective.
Der rationale Antisemitismus muss jedoch eine systematische, legale Kampagne gegen die Juden betreiben, indem er ihnen die besonderen Privilegien entzieht, die sie im Gegensatz zu den anderen unter uns lebenden Ausländern genießen.
The last word people associate with the Nazis is legal. But for Hitler and his minions, this was very important. They passed law after devastating law. That was the German way. And in the end, they made murder legal. Jews, after all, were considered foreigners. Never mind that they had been living among us for centuries, that they felt more at home in Germany than in any other country on earth. We must revoke any privileges they have in law.
Aber das Endziel muss die Entfernung der Juden überhaupt.
Die Entfernung der Juden überhaupt. Historians scrutinize every word in German, trying to find out exactly what Hitler meant. The complete removal. Was Hitler's anti-Semitism murderous even at that early date? Characteristically, he writes in euphemism. He is deliberately vague, as if to say, I have a nightmare. Jews are present. I have a dream. Jews disappear. He doesn't say how they are to disappear. Simply gone. But thanks to this important letter from 1919, we know that what Hitler wrote years later in Mein Kampf, after he became a politician, is in fact accurate. This was his racial ideology.
Okay, so you get a sense of it. The other video that I have is about the final solution, and I can just maybe highlight this. I'm Professor Kenneth Hanson of the University of Central Florida Judaic Studies program, and I'd like to share, with a little help from AI, some important insight about the most horrific genocide in all of human history, the Shoah, otherwise known as the Holocaust. In this case, focusing on 1 year in particular in which the so-called final solution took shape. Of course, we're accustomed to looking at the Holocaust through the eyes of the victims, millions of them. But we can't really understand the terrible events that took place without considering the motives of the perpetrators. When did the final solution actually arise in the minds of the murderous Nazis? Can we pinpoint the exact moment in which Hitler's madness was transformed from wild rhetorical flourishes to serious design? One thing is clear. Nothing was set in stone, even well into the Nazi reign of terror. Things could have taken a very different course had it not been for decisions taken in 1 year in particular. But first, we need to consider the question of how the Nazis chose to govern and to rule. Were the German people cowering in fear as Hitler forced them to do his
My name is Samuel Spielman. I'm a Polish Jew. My wife Estera and I are the proud parents of 2 daughters, Regina, a lawyer, and Halina, and 2 sons, Henrik, an accomplished writer, poet and musician, and Władysław, a pianist. I was sent here to this camp, this death camp, called Treblinka in Nazi-occupied Poland. Somehow we are still alive in this camp of death. Władysław is missing. He was miraculously pulled from the line as we were being loaded on a transport in the Warsaw Ghetto that brought the rest of us to this murder factory. We can only hope that he's still alive, somewhere in Warsaw. If we somehow survive, our only goal will be to help people understand how this murder, this genocide, could have been unleashed on my people, the Jewish people. First of all, we have to get into the heads of the Nazis. Truth be told, the Nazis well understood that you don't rule with terror.
So that's what I'm able to do with AI. We even brought Joseph Goebbels.
Goebbels might have been thinking to himself,
Uns Nazis kam ein faschistischer Staat wie Italien unter Franco einer Stagnation gleich. Es muss eine anhaltende Kulturrevolution geben. Und jeder, der die Fortsetzung dieser Revolution verhindern könnte, musste entfernt werden.
By 1937, the tension...
Okay, so that's a sense of what I'm doing with AI.
It's quite perfect, actually, for the theme of the conference in terms of types of aesthetic, artistic ways of bringing Holocaust memory to life. So congratulations on that. I think it has a ways to go before it reaches the ultra realistic barrier, but it's still pretty dang impressive. So thank you for sharing that.
Okay, a pleasure.
Thank you, Professor. That was truly fascinating. It just made me think when you said Hitler was an opportunist, that he used to visit these elite ladies club, and he was nicknamed Wolf because he was charming and yet very opportunist.
Yeah.
Professor, would it be correct, or how far would it be correct to say that Holocaust could be considered as the practical application of Mein Kampf? And how far did the prevailing anti-Semitism during Hitler's time influenced his ideology? For instance, we have Richard Wagner's music, the so-called Aryanization of music in Nazi Germany. I would love to have your opinion on this.
Well, there's a lot that has been written about the prevailing anti-Semitic currents in Europe as a whole, specifically in Germany. So many different levels, angles of it. Jews, of course, felt more at home in Germany than in any other country. They thought of it as a new Eden, as a matter of fact. So why would the Holocaust begin there? The current was anti-Semitic. Anti-Semitism was politically correct in Germany. That's one way to think of it. If you asked Hjalmar Schacht about the Jews, he would spout all of the anti-Semitic stuff that you'd hear from any of the hierarchy, or many, if not most, of the German people, in fact. It was common. But what I wanted to emphasize that there is a difference between anti-Semitism, the kind of stuff that Wagner put out, and a different level, an exterminatory type of anti-Semitism, the most radical type of anti-Semitism. And Hitler, one way to look at him is that he is standing betwixt and between. There were the radicals around as well. Not very bright, most of them, but they were there. They had influence. They were spouting it, a very radical variety. And Hitler realized that. He also had those who were more pragmatic. And as I mentioned, Hjalmar Schacht. So he had to determine which path to follow. And he was concerned that stagnation would be the end of him, that he might be toppled himself. And I think that is why he ultimately embraced the more radical side of things. But it was really, you can look at it as a real aberration in German history and in German culture, the idea of a radical exterminatory type of anti-Semitism. That's something that was unthinkable, was really unthinkable. So it all had to do with him trying to straddle the fence, as it were. That's another way to look at the Nuremberg laws, by the way. People think of the Nuremberg laws as just a lot of rabid anti-Semitic policy, when in fact he was trying to give a crumb to the radicals and another crumb to the moderates. He didn't expel Jews from Germany. No. Even though they lost citizenship, they were still allowed to be permanent residents within Germany. They couldn't fly the German colors, but they could fly the Jewish colors. And even the Jewish population, as shocked as they were, they thought to themselves, we can survive this too. It was 1935. And still they stayed in Germany. They didn't flee because they weren't sure which way it was going to go.
Dr. Hanson, so could you clarify for me then? Because what I'm hearing you say is it sounds like Adolf Hitler is trying to balance the moderates and the radicals. But I thought he, all the way back in 1919, that he was part of the radicals. He was exterminatory, or at least there's a good chance he was. So is it that he himself was exterminatory, anti-Semitic, and needed to straddle the fence until he got full power and ability to do it? Or was it more of he was probably more moderately anti-Semitic and then became radicalized because of the people surrounding him?
The radicalization was in his policy, how to outwork it. I don't think his ideology changed. And that's what the 1919 letter tells us. It gets us into the heads of the Nazis, how they could exterminate without batting an eye. But that doesn't mean you're going to do it. In fact, if we understand him correctly, I have a nightmare, Jews are present. I have a dream, Jews disappear. Did he really care how they disappear? As long as they're out of the Reich. there was, in fact, the floating of the Madagascar plan. Let's just send them all to Madagascar. We'll deal with them later, as long as they're out of the Reich. And that was a serious plan that was put forth. The Allies wouldn't have anything to do with it in the end. But it didn't necessarily mean that he was out to exterminate at that early time. If you think that, then that makes you an extreme intentionalist. And that is not widely held in Holocaust scholarship. I think a more accepted view of things is the functionalist approach that sees an evolution in the outworking of the Holocaust and ultimately becoming a function of the Second World War, without which it couldn't have happened, wouldn't have happened. It took the fog of war to finally bring it about, plus the radicalization. And yeah, he was straddling the fence. I mean, his ideology didn't change, but how do you implement it? How do you implement it?
So eventually, the Jewish problem needs to disappear, or the Jewish race should disappear. How you make that happen, and maybe the when you make it happen, it was what was evolving for him.
Yeah. And I think that the whole ideology revolved around the Jews, not around Aryan superiority. That's another issue that we can get into. Some people imagine that it was all about Aryan supremacy, and then the Nazis had to apply it to various minority groups. And the Jews just happened to be the most prominent, easiest to apply it to. I take the opposite view. I think that it was about the Jews ultimately. And then the Nazis had to construct a racial ideology to justify the hatred of Jews. And then in order to be consistent, they had to apply it to other non-Jewish groups, populations, gypsies, homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, etc., in order to be consistent. The idea was Aryanization, yes. Not necessarily now, but it will be a continuing process that must never end. Out of the Reich for now, we'll send them to Madagascar as long as they're out of here, but eventually we will deal with them. And because of the ideology we constructed, we now have to deal with all other non-Aryans, which we will do eventually. I like to contrast Nazism with Marxism, with Judaism, with Christianity, with Islam, with Western faith perspectives, which are fundamentally directional, going somewhere. Eventually we'll get there, whether it's the Messiah, the second coming of Christ, the final judgment of Muhammad, or a classless society. Marxism. Marxism can properly be understood as a Jewish heresy. Marx coming from a Jewish background himself. This is his version of the Messianic age, just secularized. Hitler and Nazi racial ideologues hated this. Because what's the end of all these systems? Stagnation. What, the lion lays down with the lamb? What is that? The lion should eat the lamb. There must be a continuing purification of the race. Not an arrow, not a direction, but a spiral. Turning in on itself, tighter and tighter and tighter. Today, we're in league with the Japanese, with the Italians. But tomorrow, even they will be our targets, until the only ones left will be the purest of the purest of the purest of the purest, and it will never, ever end, because even after all of them are gone, there will still be the abstract Jewish spirit that will have to be dealt with. There can be no end. There can be no final messianic age or classless society. It must be a continuing purification of the folk. That's the ideology. But the outworking of it is political. And that's where Hitler is doing a dance between the moderates and the radicals, and he honestly doesn't know where to go. Even as late as 1935, he doesn't know. And that's the tragedy of it. One of the tragedies of it. It didn't have to go that way. If there had been someone else, some other Nazi in power, wouldn't have happened. If Hitler had been eliminated, wouldn't have happened.
Let me ask another clarifying question. You and I had discussed this very topic before, and I thought I understood what part of your argument was that it's traditional to say there was the German war against Europe, and then the German war against Jewry as two separate things. And I kind of thought that your argument before when we talked was that no, it's always just been the war of Jewry, and that the war in Europe was the mechanism to make the Holocaust happen. Did I misunderstand in the past?
Now I'm thinking.
Because I got the impression that World War II was needed in order to get into the territories to round up more Jews, to exterminate the cancer throughout Europe. But it wasn't necessarily, there was some beef with Europe, but not the total mass, total war.
Well, part of the ideology was that eventually the Reich will encompass the whole world. Eventually, absolutely. So that's why we can send them to Madagascar now and deal with them later. But part of it was the broader vision, beginning with Lebensraum, but it will encompass everything. We will have one final Reich that will be worldwide. And of course, it will be Judenrein. So I'm not saying that there were not two different wars. There was World War II, and there was the war against the Jews. But they did dovetail in a sense.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah, I think, especially when you hear Hitler say that if there is going to be a war in Europe, it's going to lead to the extermination of the Jewish race. It sounds very much like, I need the war to happen so that we can get exterminating. So he keeps on pushing the envelope. He invades.
But the Jews were behind everything. So the Jews were controlling the Allies. The entire Western world were just puppets of the Jews. So yeah, it's all part of one big ideology in that sense. Everything that was against Hitler was Jewish spirit. Churchill had Jewish spirit. FDR had Jewish spirit. The Lend-Lease Act was Jewish spirit. Everything that was against Hitler was Jewish spirit. And sure, the Jews were a financial conspiracy controlling the world.
What I love about this approach to Holocaust studies and to history is the notion that it gives a real plausible explanation for the very bizarre thing we saw in the last 2 years of the war, which was, instead of diverting resources and money to the war front, to the soldiers on the front lines, the time, money, energy, and resources were diverted to rounding up more Jews and sending them to death camps.
Yeah.
So
that war was every bit as important, if not more important, than the war against the Allies. Whether you can call them one war, I hadn't really thought about that. Maybe that would be another book that would be written. There's really one war. Because the objectives do coincide. The ideology does coincide. But it's part of a larger view of all of humanity, and this continuing purification of the race. And yeah, that's why Hitler had to attack Russia as well. Curiously, Stalin understood this, that the Jews in the Pale of Settlement, which would be the western regions of Russia, were bait for Hitler. He realized Hitler's he's so intent on destroying the Jews, he's going to invade these western territories of Russia. So what does Stalin do? He forcibly evacuates large numbers of the Jews living in what used to be the Pale of Settlement and moves them east into Siberia. Not because he liked Jews or because he wanted to save Jews. He didn't care about Jews at all. But this is something Holocaust scholars look at very curiously. Stalin inadvertently saved a lot of Jewish lives for that reason, because he was afraid of Hitler and he moved them east.
Wow.
But it does give us a sense of how fixated on the Jews Hitler was. Somebody said if Hitler ever invites you to a cocktail party, of course he didn't drink, but whatever you do, don't mention the Jews, because he'll go off. You'll never get him back. He was that maniacally focused on the Jews.
Is there any evidence that when the war for Germany started to fall apart and it was becoming more evident that they were going to lose the war, is there any evidence that he was blaming Jews, like Jewish conspirators, Jewish saboteurs, that still Jews were behind even the failures of the German military, and maybe thinking that's why we need to continue to try and exterminate more, because the more of the cancer we get rid of, the better the war will go?
Well, he knew, of course, that the Jews were out of Germany and had been rounded up from Poland. So I don't think he really imagined that Jews were, well, he knew they were fighting in the resistance. You know, I don't know how seriously he took that, but he was convinced that it was all Jewish spirit too. So to that extent, yes, everything revolved around the Jewish spirit. And your question again was,
if he had a bit of a conspiracy theorist type mindset.
I definitely did.
At the end, or when the war was going south for them, was he blaming Jews or was he blaming?
Oh, sure, he was blaming Jews the whole way through.
Okay.
It's all against him. And it was all Jewish, but it was all against him. And if anything, it accelerated the final solution. And this was a real problem for those wanting rescue action to help Jews, even in the West. Various Jewish associations who had contact with Roosevelt and with the British, they wanted the West to take retaliatory and rescue action, but they were afraid by the same token that if they did, it would even be worse off for the Jews, because Hitler would blame the Jews for the rescue action. He would tighten the screws all the more. Albert Speer said, okay, this is after the war was over in the Nuremberg trials and so on. You wonder why the Allies didn't bomb the railroad lines. He said they could have, but Hitler would have repaired them quickly. Even if Hitler bombed the camps, even if the Allies bombed the camps, Hitler was so intent on the final solution, even that wouldn't have stopped him. He would have gone back to bullets.
See, that's the kind of stuff that makes me think or at least entertain the possibility that we're actually dealing with just one war, and that the military actions was meant to gather Jews, was meant as the main vehicle for doing it, for enacting the Holocaust. I mean, I don't have the whole thing fleshed out by any sense. I would like to get your thoughts about this. I'm curious about the cancer analogy, and that the idea that Jews were nothing but vermin. They were subhuman.
Disease, correct.
Yeah. And that that it's no different from when you call an exterminator.
Exactly.
That seems to conflict. In my mind, it conflicts with, and I understand that potentially for people like Hitler and some of the people, the architects of the final solution,
Himmler.
that was they were not human, but for the general German people and German soldiers, how sure are we that they bought into the disease vermin ideology? And the reason I'm asking is because we know that they had to get drunk a lot in order to shoot them. They were falling apart mentally when they were attempting to kill them, which led to the gas chambers as a solution for that. We also know that Germans would regularly rape Jewish women, and exterminators don't really rape the cockroaches. So,
well, if for those who had problems with the shooting, then the response of the Nazis was, you just don't understand sufficiently. You haven't been sufficiently educated. I'm serious. That's the way they thought. This was the SS that was charged with this. They were Hitler's hitmen, and they were indoctrinated and socialized, the Hitler Youth, from early on. They were supposed to understand. If they didn't understand, they hadn't been properly trained and educated. That was the problem. So I'm sorry if you just don't get it. Okay, if you are an Orkin man, and maybe you just don't like looking at dead cockroaches all day, and I certainly wouldn't. Now, I have no trouble with calling the Orkin man or killing the cockroaches. I want them all dead. I have no trouble with that. I just don't want to do it. See, so I understand it needs to be done, but personally, it freaks me out to have to do this job and stare at dead cockroaches. So I would just resign from that position. And the Nazis had no trouble with this. If you are upset by the extermination of Jews, well, we can reassign you. That's it. You don't have to do this. So they didn't round up SS members who didn't want to shoot Jews and punish them. They said, no, we just, goodbye. Find somebody else who does, who understands it better, who's not bothered by it, who just is not bothered by it. And hence also the desire to find more efficient and humane ways to do the extermination. If I don't want to physically go around stepping on cockroaches, maybe I'll get a bomb, one of those bombs, and put it in my house, and that way I don't have to look at it, and that's all right too. So yeah, it bothers certain people. So the Nazis wanted to help find better ways, more efficient ways, and preserve bullets, all of that. But absolutely, that is exactly how they thought. And you find even commandants of camps, commandant of Auschwitz, supervise all this during the day, go home and have a nice meal with his family. So he got it. He had no, for those who didn't, goodbye. But for those who understand properly the Nazi racial ideology, then this is what we go with. And people are surprised at how many Germans were able to go through with this, and it didn't bother them, didn't bother their consciousness at all. I have students who ask me this, and this is how I explain it. It's not hard to understand at all if you understand the ideology.
It's interesting, and I appreciate that analogy a lot, actually. Yeah, because even the sound of a crushing cockroach under my boot is, it's gross, but I still know it's a cockroach.
Yes, and another example is from a actual class I was teaching at another college here in the Orlando area called Rollins. It was an evening class on the Holocaust. It was years ago. I'll never forget it. I invited the class out to a local sidewalk cafe for a talk, a discussion, in lieu of our regular class meeting. And various things some libations were ordered. These are somewhat more mature students. It was fine. And I've got my glass of white Zinfandel, and we're talking about Nazi racial ideology and we're out on the street corner, right? It's tables, facing out in the open, facing the street. And from the restaurant itself is open, the bar is, and right from the bar area, I think from the kitchen, crawling across the pavement was a cockroach. It was the most bizarre thing, right? When I was talking about this. And the cockroach was headed straight for me, of all, exactly for me. So we were having a great discussion. I didn't want to interrupt anything. And as the cockroach approached me, I stomped. I just stomped on the pavement and scared the cockroach, and it scampered off back toward the kitchen. That was Kristallnacht. That was Kristallnacht. It was the great stomp. And even then, the Germans would have been more than happy to allow the Jews to leave. Raus! Get out of the Reich. And students are surprised. What, you mean the Nazis weren't weren't holding the Jews captive? No. No. We'll deal with you later. It's this endless spiral. Right now, just disappear. And sure enough, the cockroach left. A few minutes later, it came back. Same cockroach, exactly toward me. And this time, I just stepped on it. I felt no remorse whatsoever. I had killed a sentient being. The only thing I was concerned about is that I now had this mush on the bottom of my shoe. But it could not have been arranged more perfectly for a class on the Holocaust to explain what happened.
Interesting. Yeah, interesting. And it makes me think of the Nuremberg war crime tribunals. And I don't know off the top of my head if any of the SS officers had said, or I guess tried to defend themselves by saying, but they're Jews, they're cockroaches, or they're a cancer. Why is this? As opposed, what I recall is we were just following orders. So do you know of anybody who was saying, no, that don't you get it? Why? And kind of thinking of of why they're even on trial as being bizarre?
It would be the answer of an Orkin man. Okay, I'm just doing my job, or a hitman. I mean, I didn't even know the person that I killed. I didn't know him. It was from a distance. And by the way, it was a little different because they didn't actually pull the triggers. They just organized. And following orders, I'm a cog in the machinery, but the killing is not, I'm not going to address that. I am the Orkin man. I'm doing my job. And that's it.
Well, I have one more question for you to explore with me. Earlier this year, when we held our religious trauma conference, we had multiple, and I think actually two, if not three, presentations discuss what is being referred to as post-traumatic slavery syndrome. And this is in discussion of trauma in the Black community, but generational trauma dating back to the slavery being passed on from generation to generation, and just kind of what that might mean for the community, not only the Black community, but the religious community. So I had already said, in those presentations, I don't like the word syndrome being thrown in there. It pathologizes things a little bit too much, and it's not exactly accurate. But with the current war in Israel, and with whether you are critical or supportive of the bombardment of Gaza, whether you think it is exactly what should be done, or it is so disproportionate that it borderlines on war crimes or something, the response is strong. I think we can all agree that Israel's response, whether you think it's right or not, is strong, powerful, a big punch.
Mm-hmm.
If there is such a thing as a post-traumatic slavery syndrome, would it be fair to say that Jews, especially Israelis, might suffer from a post-traumatic Holocaust syndrome? That anything that starts to look like a pogrom or another genocide, you're going to see a trauma response, which is basically a fight mode. And and forgive me for being trite about this with my terms, but you're going to see them go berserk as a trauma response.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. And I think there is an element of that. The Holocaust is very fresh in the minds of Israelis. When I studied the Holocaust in Israel, actually my whole training in Holocaust studies was at Yad Vashem in Israel. It couldn't have been better. But it was really amazing how much of the teaching came back to the state of Israel. We even went on field trips across Israel that seemingly had nothing to do with the Holocaust, but they were pointing out on field trips the Golan Heights and the necessity of keeping the Golan Heights in Israeli hands to prevent the kind of bombardment from Syria that had taken place for years and years, decades, up until the 1967 war, when Israel conquered the Golan. And we're wondering, okay, and I happen to agree with that, but I mean, why is this part of the Holocaust course? It is Israel cannot be separated from the experience of the Holocaust. You're absolutely right in that regard. Before I forget, I would like to contrast what happened on the 7th of October with the Nazis. There's a lot of comparison, and Israelis compare this to the Nazis.
Yeah, please do.
Similar, of course, in the magnitude of the tragedy that has affected so many Israelis. But in terms of what I'm talking about, Nazi racial ideology, very different. And for example, Kristallnacht was not looked upon well by the Nazi hierarchy. This is something that isn't often stressed. People think, oh yeah, that's Kristallnacht. That was exactly what the Nazis wanted. The follow-up reports on Kristallnacht were ineffective. And in fact, it was likened to a pogrom. And rather than calling it Kristallnacht, we ought to call it Pogrom Night. Is what it was. And what did Hitler write in that 1919 letter? He referenced specifically pogroms, which are capricious and therefore ineffective. And by the way, motivated by hate and emotion. So what Hamas did on October 7th was a pogrom. And in a sense, worse than what the Nazis did. It's hard to imagine. Israelis even commented, I heard this. One of them said, even the Nazis, all they did was slaughter us. Even the Nazis did not behead our children. Because if you were an Orkan man, your job is not to behead children, is to eliminate the infection. Not with hatred. Elie Wiesel said, they didn't even hate us. He didn't experience hatred. Can you imagine? Fundamentally different is what Hamas did. Accomplishing, of course, the same kind of horrific death. But that's something I had to say. But beyond that, yeah, Israel feels it definitely. But to the other part of your question, is that the reason that Israel has responded and is responding the way that it has? And on that level, I don't think so. Yes, they think of the Holocaust always. But in terms of their conduct of the war, they're doing this as soldiers. And I think any country's soldiers would do this if you want to win a war. When FDR and Churchill decided to go after the Third Reich, what did we do? We bombed Berlin into rubble. And did anybody count the number of innocent women and children under the rubble of Berlin? Of course, it's sad when any life is extinguished. But the job of a soldier is to win the war. And that's what you do, unless you plan to lose it. And had we been of another mindset, say the same mindset that many in the world community have today regarding the war in Gaza, I'm convinced we would have lost the Second World War. We would have negotiated with Hitler, left him in power in the end. He would not have gone away, because the way to win a war is you have to, whatever the cost, you win it. Or in the Civil War, for example, Lincoln had incredible problems with his generals, as we know. He had no link with the Holocaust, obviously. He was trying to win a war. And he kept firing. He fired McClellan until he finally found a General Sherman who would do it. And Sherman was absolutely ruthless. Burned everything to the ground. Horrible, but that's how you win a war. War is hell, but you don't go into it unless you plan to win it, or you will lose. And of course, Lincoln could have negotiated, and we've had two different independent countries, right? The North and the South.
Well, war is not politically correct. Is great, and it's been said that Israel seems to be the only country that is not allowed to win a war.
No, Ukraine is not either.
Well,
we give them just enough so that they don't lose, and because I don't know why, but that's the modern thinking. So
yeah.
I think it's about military tactics, though you're absolutely right that the Holocaust is absolutely in the mind of every Israeli. I do,
and I know we need to wrap up. I would push back just a little bit on the notion that it is purely just soldiers. Netanyahu is not a soldier. He was, but he's made it very explicit in his public statements. This is about revenge. He's used that word multiple times. This is revenge. This is revenge. This is revenge. And so,
but he's speaking as a politician at that point, because that's what the people want to hear.
Well,
when the conduct of the war is up to the general staff. He's got guns there.
But even after 9/11, us Americans, we were all beating the war drums. We were bloodthirsty and wanting revenge. And this, to me, is a very natural response and very expected to response to a traumatic event and to trauma. So that it's a trauma response. And I'm not trying to pass any judgment or criticism. I'm just also not wanting to, whitewash. That's not the right word for it, but I don't want to make it seem like it is just, well, we're at,
we wanted revenge, but what did we do? We turned it over to Stormin Norman, the general, and we let him conduct the war. And he did his job as a general, as a soldier, and he knew how to win. So fortunately, he didn't have to bomb the enemy into oblivion. But it depends on the situation. In the case of Berlin, that's exactly what we had to do, sadly enough.
It's interesting. Last thing I wanted to comment and just piggyback on what you had said was, Sam Harris had recently said this on his program that he said something along the lines of, at least the Nazis knew that they were committing crimes and tried to cover it up.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And felt some shame. But Hamas joyfully and gleefully did it and broadcasted on social media, wanted to document it and celebrated it. So just to piggyback on what you're saying, there is a lot of parallels and yet shockingly some stark contrasts.
There certainly are. Yeah. And while the Nazis wanted to cover up everything, I think it was because they feared that, of course, they were going to lose the war and they feared what the Allies would do to them. But even in Hitler's last will and testament, he was not covering anything up. The one thing I am proud of is that I have eliminated the poison, he called it, of international Jewry.
Wow. Thank you. I know we ran past time, so everybody listening right now, thank you for joining us. And Dr. Hanson, thank you so much for your presentation. I will let you have the last word.
I just appreciate being part of this. I appreciate getting to share what to me, again, I'll say is the most important thing I could possibly share when it comes to this particular